There is something in your brain that you have caused by doing something on a weekly basis, even daily basis for some, that is making you blow your load in the bedroom way before you're ready, only to ruin the moment and the pleasure, well, they were most likely hoping to receive. Now, coming too soon, once or twice, no biggie. But if you're watching this video, my guess is you know the pain and the humiliation one can feel from blowing it too soon, time and time again, not just affecting your love life, but your entire life. Now, this might not be what you're expecting either. This is something you have unfortunately already done in the past, sealing your fate and your performance. Now, as a fellow, but now former two-pump chump with premature ejaculation, I too had to learn this the hard way, and that is something I had been doing for years led to this unfortunate outcome and lack of sexual performance. And if you don't know what this thing is, my bet is it's something you're still doing right now, not even realizing it, only further worsening your performance when it matters most. Now, I'm hoping that after you watch this video, you'll realize what that thing is, how you can fix it, and to make sure you never do it again, finally allowing you to unlock your ability to control your load, climaxing when and how you want. Now, trust me, to have someone expect to get you off like it's going to be fast and easy, only for them to think, what the fuck, you're still going? It not only takes them by surprise, increasing the pleasure, but it also allows them to finally relax and sink into the experience. Kind of like getting swept up in a really good movie, knowing that the power or the television isn't going to turn off a quarter way through. Okay. So let's get into what is happening in your brain, making you come too soon. Now, I don't know about you, but when I figured out at a young age the pleasure that one can experience with this beautiful tool between our legs and started getting myself off, the last thing I was thinking about was pleasuring the one-day person I would be sharing the experience with in many different ways. Neither did I realize that the way I was pleasuring myself was in fact digging myself a hole, worsening my future performance I would one day hope to have. Now, each and every time I would get off in this particular way, I would get deeper and deeper in that hole, not knowing I would eventually have to undo this ingrained pattern. And to make things worse, what started out such a long time ago had continued as a habit. So the way that I got myself off then continued to be the way that I got myself off even way after I began having sex, not realizing it was in fact still one of the reasons my bedroom stamina suffered, causing a massive lack of confidence and even relationship issues, feeling like I wasn't pulling my weight in the bedroom. Now, many of you may think, okay, so the solution is a very common prescription called edging, or maybe even the start-stop method. Essentially, methods of practicing slowing down stimulation. Now, I thought the same thing when I first came across them as a solution, but unfortunately, it may not result in what you were hoping for, because it certainly didn't help me. And I'm going to explain why in this video if you're in the same boat. Now, these types of methods are essentially missing more than 90% of what you need to focus on. And if you don't know what I'm going to explain in this video, you could try these methods, but actually make things worse. Now, if only I knew then what I know now. All right, remember this line: neurons that fire together wire together. This simply means that your brain remembers all associations, bringing your reality together through your mental narratives, your emotions, and your physical experiences of the world. Now, to really make you realize how powerful this is, there is a video on YouTube called The Backwards Brain Bicycle. You should check it out after this video. Now, this is just one example of the way that our brain can create patterns to help us do things in life more efficiently without having to think about them as much as when we first learned the behavior or the action. Now, in this video, Dustin takes on the challenge to learn how to ride a bike that has had the steering actually reversed. So you essentially steer to the right and you'll go left, steer to the left and you go right. Now, logically, you can see the bike and how it works, and you probably even start creating fancy ways of how you think you are going to achieve riding this bike. But as Dustin proves, it takes a long time to even unlearn something so ingrained like the simple act of riding a normal bike. Now, learning how to ride a bike is essentially the analogy for how you learn to pleasure yourself growing up, not realizing that one day you are going to need to know or learn how to ride the bike with the steering in reverse, so to speak, aka using the same tool you were pleasuring yourself with to pleasure someone else. Now, I will admit the analogy is not perfect, but it does a fantastic job at explaining neural connections in the brain and how hard they can be to disconnect once they are connected, no matter how bad you want a different outcome in that moment. Now, you don't have to watch the entire video to understand the point I'm trying to make. However, it really gives you a good visual on what could be happening when you have sex, feeling like you are failing over and over. Now, in the bedroom context, this is essentially you blowing your load and the moment way too soon. Now, logically, while in the moment, you could know what outcome you want, but time and time again, it may feel inevitable that as soon as you start, you know it's going to finish the same way. Now, these patterns literally need to be unlearned on a very deep level that have taken root mentally, emotionally, and physically. They all affect one another and they make the association even stronger, and as a result, unfortunately worsening your performance in the bedroom. Now, here's the weird part though. When you blow your load way too soon in the bedroom, I'm sure most won't even connect the dots and think this is because of the way I used to masturbate, or heck, even the way I currently masturbate. Now, just like if you tried to ride a bike with reversed steering, even if you can think your way through what you need to do to the very detail, in reality, it's going to take enormous effort and time to undo the learning of how you rode a normal bike in the first place. Now, the solution to this is going to come in 3 separate phases. So, to know how to unlearn mental, emotional, and physical patterns that were created from years of pleasuring yourself, essentially practice, you need to know what patterns took place and continue to get affirmed in the first place. Now, this is phase 1, identify. The second phase is replace, and the third phase is practice. Now, to represent patterns that take root, this is known as the cognitive triangle, with each corner being one of the aspects of the pattern as a whole that has been created. So first, you've got the mental, your conscious or subconscious thoughts through narratives. The second, your emotional, the way that you feel. And third, the physical, your behaviors and actions using your physical body. Now, one cannot be without the other, and each will affect the other when it comes to patterns and ways of being. This is why they all need to be addressed, not just one. Some solutions on the net or advice you've most likely received in the past may just give you physical solutions only, but without addressing the other two, mental and emotional, you still essentially have more than 60% of the total pattern running. Now, like I mentioned earlier, an example of this is edging, an exercise prescribed to help you last longer by practicing bringing yourself to the edge of climax, then slowing down or even just stopping. Now, don't get me wrong, this exercise is great and something I will even recommend you use. However, like I mentioned, it's only a tiny portion of the solution, and I'll explain why. Now, please be aware of the advice on the internet of others explaining a solution for those that are suffering with premature ejaculation or a lack of control. However, they've never actually experienced it themselves, and as a result, it technically means that they are prescribing something they have never used before, therefore, they don't even know if or how it works. Now, maybe they have heard the theory, maybe they've heard others having results, and from that, they offer it as a solution. Now, I'm all for helping others. However, I'm sure you could agree receiving advice from someone with knowledge versus wisdom, it is very different. And in this particular case, it took me years of trying solutions to finally piece things together from all over the place, including all areas of self-development, not just from this industry. I can tell you from experience, trying something like edging in the most basic form when prescribed, which is like 99.9% of the time, it never resulted in what I was hoping for, which can really demotivate you in a sexual context. In other words, it's a part of the solution and not the whole solution. Just be wary of that. Now, if you addressed even 2 of the 3 aspects, in other words, more than 60% of the total pattern running, for example, the physical and emotional, even just one aspect out of place, a simple narrative, for example, could be enough to keep the old pattern running, even though you're doing your best to unlearn and relearn through the other 2 aspects. So if you practiced edging, which is the physical, and you try to stay in a more beneficial emotion like pride or joy, rather than one you may not even know you're in, like anger or sadness, this would still not be enough if there happened to be a narrative you may not even be consciously aware of that is pushing you over the edge. Now, to prove my point and to help make this make a lot more sense, here is a quick exercise that's actually outside of the bedroom context. Now, it would be best to actually do it, but if you can't be bothered and just trust what I have to say, then you can simply imagine doing it. Okay, imagine playing an upbeat song, like a really high energy workout mix, something that actually makes you feel motivated and upbeat. Then I want you to imagine smiling ear to ear, okay? And jumping up and down with high energy. Now, in this case, a pattern is being triggered through the emotional and physical aspects. Now, due to your previous history and associations, you are way more likely to be thinking positively, thinking good thoughts, and even coming up with great ideas. Okay, now while you're still having this music playing, you're jumping up and down, smiling ear to ear, I want you to intentionally think a negative thought or narrative, like I hate myself or I suck. My bet is something will feel out of place, almost like there is a glitch in your brain. In other words, this pattern is out of place and foreign. So an existing pattern will actually want to continue and run, or another one will want to take its place. Either you're not going to believe the thought because of the other 2 aspects running, the physical and emotional, and it won't even affect you, or if there is any truth in your mind to that narrative, it could literally take over and affect the way you feel and behave. For example, your smile might lessen, and you might even start lowering the intensity to the way that you're jumping. Now, either way, this is a simple example of how powerful each aspect is of the triangle and will affect one another, and why, if you want to break a pattern to encourage a new pattern that will be beneficial to your goals, you need to address the entire triangle. Now, keep all of this in mind as we go through the 3 phases with the cognitive triangle to help you unlearn and relearn your ability to have the ultimate control in the bedroom. Now, first, it's important to understand and identify what masturbation has that sex has as well. Now, this is quite literally the bridge to how masturbation will negatively affect your performance with your sexual partner. However, it's also how we're going to intentionally build the right bridge for masturbation to positively affect sex. Now, for the sake of a basic example, on the most basic level, let's go over each aspect when you're masturbating, then translate that to sex. Now, after that, we're going to identify the deeper, more important associations to know what we're going to need to address so that you know what to replace, and then finally practice. Okay, remember this example is the most basic level so you can get a grasp of the idea, okay? Basic, and then we'll go deeper later. Now, you may have a feeling, let's say an emotion of being horny or aroused. Now, this might lead to a thought, aka a mental narrative, like, I have some time to quickly get off. This then may lead to the behavior, aka your physical action like stimulation using your hand. And then that obviously is going to lead to ejaculation. Now, this peak experience has now technically just sealed the deal as a pattern running in your brain. So horny plus I have some time to quickly get off plus stimulation equals ejaculation. Now, imagine this pattern multiplied, running probably most days of the week for many years. If you're like most guys, you probably just do what feels good, how and when you want. Now, this might include getting it over and done with quickly, and possibly with other mental narratives and emotions that are once again and unknowingly digging yourself a hole. So let's figure out what those are. Now, imagine finally getting to sex, of which will have many mental, emotional, and physical crossovers to masturbation, any of which can trigger a pattern and a pace that is not ideal for the bedroom arena, where you most likely want to last longer and have more control. Now, the biggest difference with sex, though, is sex is magnitudes greater in intensity than masturbation. So any emotion you feel could be dialed up to 10. Any thought patterns could be dialed up to 10. Any physical aspect, including the level of stimulation you feel, could also be dialed up to 10. That means if you've been masturbating in a way where you have not had someone else in mind, in other words, not knowing to pace yourself, by the time you get to sex, you've really dug yourself a hole. It will be 10 times more difficult to learn how to pace yourself with so many ingrained patterns acting as triggers in the heat of the moment. Now, this is where conscious masturbation comes in as a method of practice to have you ready for the immense intensity and pleasure sex has to offer. Now, to know how to consciously masturbate, to have the benefits actually translate to sex, you need to identify every single one of your personal aspects on the cognitive triangle. Remember, mental, emotional, and physical. However, now on a much deeper level. The basic example from earlier, again, was just so you could grasp how the way you masturbate can affect the way that you have sex. But please know, it's just an example and much too basic to provide a comprehensive solution for your personal situation. Okay, and I also want to mention, even with the deeper explanations, I can only provide examples. From those, you must figure out your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to know what to replace and to practice. This is why this video is going so deep. Now, I'm going to use myself as an example where I can, and I hope most will be able to resonate, and from that, you can create your own solutions. Who knows? My old patterns and solutions may even be all that you need. Now, I also want to point out there is not just going to be 1 or 2 patterns running in each aspect. There could unfortunately be tens to hundreds for each. However, I'm going to provide just a few examples for each, not only so you can get a grasp on how to do it yourself, but the ones that I think affected me most and will most likely be affecting most people. In other words, by replacing and practicing new patterns in their place will make the biggest difference. Now, let's begin with the physical, since it's the easiest to understand and address. Now, if you're anything like me, when I first learned about masturbation, outside of the pleasure that it can obviously create, I never thought about pacing myself, since it was me pleasuring me. I wasn't responsible for anyone else's pleasure but my own. So when I figured out that faster for me, well, felt better, I kept going faster. I realized constantly squeezing around the area of my pelvic floor, for me, felt better. Now, back then, I didn't know that I was contracting the muscles around my pelvic floor, so naturally, I squeezed the whole time and every time. Almost all the time, I would use my hand and I would be seated. Now, maybe a minority of the time, I would be laying down or standing up. Now, out of what I have just mentioned so far, for the physical aspect, there are 5 or more patterns that I could approach to replace with something to practice during masturbation to benefit and translate to sex. The first is pace. If I masturbate fast every time, not caring about how quickly I finish, the escalation in stimulation is a pattern of its own that will most likely run if you have any similar patterns from any aspect that cross over during sex. And as we now know, there obviously are many patterns that will cross over. Simply feeling horny, for example, for sex may trigger you to go faster, since that is what you're used to during masturbation. Now, going fast during masturbation is definitely not the same as going fast during sex. Remember, it's most likely 10 times more pleasurable, or at least for me. Now, I don't think I need to spell out the solution with this one, but slowing down during masturbation is going to be massively beneficial. Try to extend the time you masturbate to the ideal time you wish to have sex, if anything, a little bit longer, just to make up for that difference in greater intensity during sex. Now, just remember, anytime you feel like masturbating and you think you just want to get it done, maybe it's late at night, you've got to get up early, and you think it won't hurt, but you now know that every time you get in a quick one, this could actually be hurting your performance when it comes time to have sex. Now, if you don't have time to extend your masturbation session to 20 to 25 minutes for practice, maybe try not to. All right, the second, squeezing the pelvic floor muscles. Now, why does this feel so good? There are actually many reasons, but there are 2 main reasons that both actually affect one another. Now, the first is the fact that squeezing the pelvic floor makes you feel harder, since muscles around your pelvic floor region are squeezing on a balloon-like structure of the inner penis situated inside your body, creating more pressure. And with that more pressure, there is also more sensation on all the nerve endings throughout your entire penis. Now, the second is the pelvic floor muscles are directly connected to a part of your nervous system that is in fact responsible for allowing you and getting you to climax at all. You can literally look at contracting the pelvic floor like stepping on the accelerator pedal in your car, literally accelerating you to the finish line. So this combination, more sensation plus getting you to the finale quicker and with no one else to pleasure, it's no wonder I, and I'm sure many others, squeeze like their life depended on it because it just feels so good. However, once again, this is a pattern, and once ingrained, it almost becomes reflexive. Now, if any of the associated patterns start running from the emotional, physical, or mental aspect, you could automatically start contracting the pelvic floor. Maybe you've even experienced this in the past. You've seen someone maybe walking on the street that is super attractive, and all of a sudden your pelvic floor starts squeezing or flickering or tensing up. Or maybe the moment that your lad is touched by you or a sexual partner, you can't help but contract these muscles, even if it's for a second or two. Now, this is the pattern running from all your previous self-pleasuring sessions. Now, sure, not contracting the pelvic floor often during masturbation is not going to feel as good, but you're also not enforcing a pattern that is running when it comes to sex. aka stimulation equals reflexively contracting the pelvic floor and propelling you over the edge faster than you were probably hoping for. Now remember, if it's difficult not to contract these muscles during masturbation, imagine how hard it's going to be to control that during sex. Okay, number 3. This is where things may seem like they're going in the opposite direction. However, it's for really good reason. And that is using your hand versus something that is more stimulating and similar to sex. Now, I totally get that you can always use your hand. It's quick, easy, and efficient. However, there may also be a large gap of comparison when it comes to the level of stimulation. Sex, or at least for me, feels 10 or more times better than just using my hand. Now, all that is just to say, if I use my hand as practice, even if I try to slow down and not contract my pelvic floor the whole time, and I expect all the results to translate to sex, I'm probably in for a big surprise. Rather, you could choose a toy of your preference that is going to feel the closest to sex, and this way when masturbating with the increase in stimulation while including the steps from earlier, you'll be desensitizing in a way that is actually going to directly benefit your stamina in the bedroom. Now, you might even prefer this since going slower and not contracting the pelvic floor may even decrease your enjoyment during masturbation, so this is a great way to increase that stimulation again with the obvious upside of benefiting your sexual stamina. Okay, number 4. Now this is similar to pattern 3 in the way that while consciously masturbating, we need to get closer to the physical pattern of having sex, and that is your position. Now, if you're someone that always sits down, unless you sit down most of the time to have sex, you're actually not engaging other muscles that are turned on when you're having sex. Now, while you don't have to get this perfect, it is going to be very beneficial to mirror the positions you are in most of the time when you're having sex. Now, here's why this matters so much. Now, if you're a guy doing most of the work during sex, then chances are you are engaging muscles around the legs, the hips, and abs, and in doing so, you're also indirectly and most likely engaging muscles around the pelvic floor. Now, while the pelvic floor is a hammock of a variety of muscles and not just muscles to do with your lad, if you don't know how to control the individual muscles correctly, engaging one muscle could literally cause you to engage them all. Now, even if you consciously masturbate with the steps mentioned so far in the hopes to benefit your sexual stamina, masturbation while seated should technically make this way too easy to practice slowing down and not contracting the pelvic floor because you're not even engaging or demanding any of the surrounding muscles to turn on. Now, being in the act of sex itself and asking you to disengage the part of the pelvic floor that can propel you to the finish line sooner without having practiced before is almost like me telling you to not contract a single muscle in your abs or legs while maybe going to failure on a barbell bench press, for example. The intensity and the heat of the moment can have you squeezing every fiber of your being. Now, do you need to turn on your abs or legs for the exercise? technically no, you could get away with very little, close to no activation. Now, it's actually quite similar when it comes to the pelvic floor muscles and the muscles needed to get sexually physical. Now, as you can imagine, the best way to practice anything is just by doing the thing often. However, some may not be having sex that often, and when it comes time to get down, they might feel like a failure. Their performance may lack, further deterring either person to want to come back for more, and as a result, there is a decrease in frequency. In other words, it's like a self-perpetuating downward spiral of performance and confidence. So, if you are to practice conscious masturbation, once again, try to mimic the act of sex itself. Now, some may find this next recommendation a little weird and uncomfortable since most men are so used to just masturbating by hand, sitting down and getting it over and done with. And that is to use a toy while in a fixture as if you're penetrating your sexual partner, but instead using the toy for practice. Now, this way, you're actually engaging the muscles you would be using while having sex. However, you're actually able to practice keeping the right pelvic floor muscles minimally turned on, plus it's in a stress-free environment. It's just you and the toy. So practice away. Now, you may or may not find that weird. If anything, you've tried it before, or heck, maybe you're even doing it now. However, you may have concern of your sexual partner maybe finding it weird, even if they don't know what you get up to without them. Now, I want to stress though that whatever shameful or even guilty emotions or narratives that come up, they need to be replaced and addressed. Now, as you'll soon learn, any emotions or narratives, even while doing all the correct steps in the physical aspect, can still push you in the wrong direction, making things worse. Now, here is something to keep in mind that should help in this scenario for the last recommendation I gave. What should be looked at as weird is masturbation that is not conscious, just doing it to selfishly get off and then wonder why your performance sucks and even wonder why your partner is not interested. Quite frankly, that's a little insane. At least this way, if you were to even explain to your partner what you're trying to achieve, they would probably be happy. Heck, they might even buy you all the toys to penetrate and say, keep practicing. Okay, I think that's enough to get you on the right track of understanding the physical aspect of this equation so far. Now, remember, there could be plenty more. Just think of all the things you're doing physically while masturbating that could be having a negative effect on your sexual performance with all the information I've provided so far, and try to replace it in something that you think would benefit instead and translate to sex. Next are the emotional and mental aspects of the cognitive triangle. Now, while all three are directly associated to the nervous system, the emotional and mental aspects can deceivingly have more effect on the nervous system. And since the nervous system is directly associated to not just controlling your climax, but also your erection quality, these are extremely important to have right if you want to improve your performance overall. Now, there are many things you can do and work on the emotional state and your mental narratives to benefit your health and your sexual performance. However, remember, the ones we're going to focus on in this video are the things you can do during conscious masturbation. More specifically, come to realize the patterns you have been running during masturbation that have not been very conscious, and as a result, whether you realize that or not, has made your performance under the sheets suffer. Now, when it comes to the nervous system, I like to think of it on a spectrum, with the sympathetic nervous system on the very right and the parasympathetic nervous system on the very left. Now, the first being responsible for fighting, fleeing, and freezing, aka getting yourself out of danger from any threats, real or imagined. And confusingly, I'll admit, it's also the system responsible for allowing you to climax at all. But if you operate too far into this side during sex, it can also cause some form of erectile dysfunction and or premature ejaculation. This is why I like to refer to this system as the intense system. Now, the second, the parasympathetic nervous system, this is responsible for resting, digesting, growing, and procreating, aka having sex. Now, also being the right amount into this side allows you to achieve an erection at all, then actually maintain hardness and control of your climax. Now, just like the other side, if you're too far into this side, your nervous system may not be aroused enough to even get an erection at all. This is why I like to refer to this side as the relaxed system. Now, what does all this have to do with the emotional and mental aspects when it comes to masturbation and sex? A lot. Anytime you're in an emotional state or thinking a mental narrative, consciously or even subconsciously, that could affect your nervous system to be operating more in the intense side, the more likely you are to climax very quickly, because you're already so far into that side of the system that, remember, is responsible for allowing you to climax. But if you're not consciously masturbating and you're just getting off fast, you're probably not thinking anything of it because you're not trying to last longer during masturbation. If anything, you could be in an emotional state or having thoughts that make you want to masturbate as a means of relieving that pressure and finally relaxing again. Now imagine this. You have a big day of work, you're stressed about tomorrow, you barely get time to yourself, you think you might not even be able to get to sleep tonight because of how much stress you're under. So, naturally, you are drawn to something that ends up relaxing you, something like masturbation. Even though it results in further pushing your body into the intense system initially, after climaxing, you actually drift back down into the relaxed system. Now, if these systems are not making total sense in the context of masturbation and sex, I'm sure this will. Now, imagine the day that I just detailed before. So high stress, lack of time, etc. But now you actually masturbate and instead you don't finish. Just see what happens. My bet is you'll feel like you are going to explode, and not in the way that you were hoping for. Okay, now with the context of the nervous system explained, let's dig deeper into the emotional and mental aspects contributing to a lack of control. Now, there are so many examples I can provide. However, I'm going to explain only a few that I think are probably the most common. Now, on the emotional side, everyone has what is known as an emotional home. This is simply your emotional state most of the time. Now, I think the same can be said for the emotional home, but rather the one that you feel that draws you to feel like masturbating or even having sex. Now, just like the example from earlier, your emotional trigger might be stress, anger, or even anxiety, and then using masturbation or sex as a coping mechanism to relax. If this is the case, then whatever you're doing during masturbation will start to tie themselves to those emotions. Now, this might mean that you may approach sex in the same way, which could result in very selfish intentions. Now, even if you went into sex with good intentions, say happy, loving, and even selfless, the moment you get stimulation or any of the other associations to masturbation are triggered, you could have those other emotional patterns start to take over and throw your nervous system into the intense side, resulting in you climaxing way before you or they want. Now, stress and negative emotions that push someone's nervous system into the intense side or system are usually massive reasons to want to masturbate for that relief. And as you can now see, that is the worst time to masturbate in a way that is not conscious. Now, the solution for this is if you feel like masturbating in this state, this is when it is even more critical that you do it slowly and extend the time. In other words, very consciously. Now, this way you're even practicing lasting longer in that intense state. It might be harder, but again, the important note is do it consciously. Now, obviously, the better option would be to be in a state that is more positive when masturbating, but sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do. Now, just remember to be conscious about it and ask, could this have a consequence to my sexual stamina? Now, I also want to mention that you can also experience positive emotions and still masturbate in a way that will cause a negative outcome to your sexual performance. Now imagine if you're in a good mood. Maybe you've got all the time in the world. You finished all your work, you've had an amazing day. Heck, you've actually earned a bit of pleasure, so why not enjoy some solo action? Now, while these are more positive emotions, they won't necessarily be pushing you into the intense side of the nervous system to start with. If you're still not conscious about slowing down and not contracting the pelvic floor while in these emotional states, then they could be tied to the pace and the tension of the pelvic floor muscles, once again creating patterns that won't be beneficial when it comes time to perform under the sheets. So, if you were to go into sex with these feel-good emotions, they too could be a trigger to push you over the edge because your brain is so used to, for example, happy and horny equals fast and tense stimulation equals ejaculation. Now, combine that with the intensity of sex and then try to change the pattern during sex in the heat of the moment, good luck. Now, in summary, The emotional aspects during masturbation, as you can tell, you can literally feel anything, good or bad, and still choose to masturbate. But remember the key word, consciously. Now just know that when masturbating, even in spite of being in a negative emotion, it has more chance to provide less results, or there is a chance of making things worse. Please just remember that. And also please remember, it's one thing to listen to what I'm saying. It's another thing to be in the experience, feeling those emotions, and not let them drive your actions away from a pattern that may have been running for years. It's almost like me telling a drug addict after being away from his poison of choice for weeks, then me offering up a handful of whatever his poison is and saying, how about you just take it slow and have a little bit at a time? Let's be honest. How do you think that is going to go down? Okay, finally, last but not least, the mental aspect. Now, this one can be a tricky one since most of the narratives that run in people's minds are subconscious. In other words, beneath the surface. Now, we wouldn't have time to process every thought pattern that came up. However, most people will have very similar patterns running most of the time, and the same can be said in different scenarios in life, including while we masturbate and even have sex. Now, these subconscious thought patterns are more or less blind spots unless brought to the surface. Now, this can be done by sitting with your feelings and seeing what thought patterns actually come up. And as you can imagine, not many people want to do that. I'm sure many think it's either too much effort, or maybe those thoughts are attached to feelings that are painful to face head on. Now, they could be statements or questions, even sometimes just single words, any of which are super powerful and can dictate the way that we feel and therefore dictate the way that we act in the world, including the way that we masturbate and have sex. Now, you may have had a pattern of thought running from when you began masturbating, maybe many years ago, and as a pattern does, it has kept running even until now, making its way into the bedroom in a negative way. Now, the question is, does this thought pattern serve you in the bedroom, or could it be causing a lack of performance? Now, once again, there are so many examples I could provide. However, I'll try to provide the ones I think will affect most people. All right, I'm going to start with the use of porn and a couple of subconscious thought patterns that you may not be aware are still running if you have not replaced them by now. Now, remember, these thoughts are sneaky. You may have created them yourself, or they may have formed organically on their own. Sometimes it's not even about what you think, it can also be about what you don't think. Confusing, I will admit. I'm sure most of us felt like kids in a candy store when we first laid eyes on pages or a screen full of raw nakedness. The time when we realized our lad pretty much had a head of his own and sometimes even called the shots. Now, I want you to imagine what is going on if you were to masturbate to porn. I mean, really, what is happening? You are watching other people have sex or watching someone on their own that you maybe find ridiculously attractive. Let's be honest, you don't go to porn to look at a 5 out of 10, right? You've got access to unlimited numbers of your perceived 10 out of 10. Now, because of that, what narrative do you think could be forming on its own and run as a pattern from the emotional and physical aspect and start tying that to the scenario? Maybe I could never be with a person like that. Now, just using that narrative on its own, let's play this out as an example for a second that may or may not be a narrative you've run, then we'll get onto a couple more soon. Now, this narrative could have the potential to make you feel emotions like shame for even getting off to someone you clearly think that is out of your league. Maybe a bit of guilt or worthlessness. Now, here's the strange part. Masturbation feels good, and during the process, it may be super easy to ignore the narratives and other more negative emotions and feelings that are forming, most likely without you even knowing it. This could be causing havoc to you long term. Even if you don't think you feel negative emotions during sex or masturbation, let's think about it truthfully. Not masturbating in a conscious way with the intent of improving your performance, selfishly and quickly getting off to someone you think you could never get with, someone that will most likely never know you exist. By the time you finish, if you truly dug deep and asked yourself honestly, how do you feel? My guess is it wouldn't be good. But you have now climaxed, experiencing a peak state. It's almost like hitting the save button on your computer, saving the patterns you've just run on an emotional mental, and physical aspect. So imagine this to paint a better picture. On the physical aspect, you're masturbating fast, tense the whole time, you're using your hand in front of a computer watching porn. On an emotional aspect, you're stressed from the day, now you're merging those feelings with guilt and shame after you finish. And finally, the mental aspect. Running a thought pattern, something like, I'm not worth being with a person like that. Now that right there is a concoction built to ruin your sex life. And the worst part, it's running on autopilot from years of practice. Now, you might not even be doing this with porn. You might do it with someone you saw in the street or at the gym. Now, we men are quite visual creatures, right? Let's be honest. We seem to need something. But what can be a result if we're not careful is running a thought pattern we didn't know we were forming, one that has a negative consequence. Now, instead, having a thought pattern that was more in line with feeling confident, competent, and abundant would do a much better job at serving you when it comes to masturbation and finally sex. But it must be something that you believe. And if the actions or feelings don't really match the narrative, this may also cause a disconnect and as a result, not lead to the benefits that you're after. For example, if you masturbated to porn and forced yourself to think something like, I could get any of these women any day of the week. Sure, that is abundant thinking, but would you actually believe that if, let's say, you've never been with someone like that, maybe you're single, maybe you haven't even had sex in months or even years? Come on, let's be honest, I don't think so. That sounds like delusion. This is where consciously masturbating gets tricky. If you can't masturbate to someone you think you couldn't get with without feeling guilt, shame, or unworthy, what do you use? Now, I've thought of a few solutions. The first, you actually masturbate to someone you think you could be with and get. And if you really want to up the quality that you visualize about, well, looks like you're going to have to get out there in the world and actually prove it to yourself that you can get higher quality because you're a high quality man. Now, this way, you're less likely to feel those negative emotions like shame or guilt. Now, another option is you can visualize on past experiences since they literally happened. You may have been worthy in those moments, so these have much less of a chance of creating negative thought patterns unless the scenario was not a healthy one, like maybe an abusive or a toxic relationship. Just be careful of that. Now, the last solution is you do in fact use visualization of quality that is out of your league, but you come at it with a sense of humility. Maybe you try to run a thought pattern along the lines of, I may not be there now, but I'm working on myself in a way that I will be worth it, and I'm using this visual to practice consciously masturbating, desensitizing to the amazing sexual experiences I will have with a person like this one day. Remember, I said this needs to be something you actually believe. If you are someone that doesn't even work on yourself, eats like crap, doesn't train, is not conscious about your health, then that narrative would technically be delusion. Most likely further enforcing negative narratives, making things, once again, worse. Now, here's the real interesting scenario that I'm sure many men will find themselves in. Now, when you're with a partner for long enough and the frequency of sex starts to maybe slow down, or at least this is what happens most of the time in most relationships, depending on the situation, some men may actually have a thought pattern that starts to form. Something like, she never puts out anymore, or why doesn't she love me? I'm sure many of you may have been there, so pick whatever the narrative is. Now, from that, try to imagine the emotion that could come up as a result. Maybe anger, or sadness, or something similar, right? Now, with your lack of sex, you're a man, so you still feel like you have a horny quota to meet, so to speak, right? However, now it could be as if you're masturbating more because of the lack of sex. So you're indirectly bringing those emotions and feelings of anger or sadness into masturbation. In this scenario, you also want to be careful because if you're not conscious about it, the times that you do get around to sex, you'll have worse performance, making things even worse. Now, the best way to spot any of these thought patterns that come up is masturbate how you normally would and just take a moment, both during and after, and ask, how did that make me feel? See if you can come up with 3 to 5 emotions, both again during and after, because I'm sure they could change drastically. Usually during masturbation and even sex, negative emotions are going to be much harder to spot because of the pleasure that could be blanketing over everything, but they will be worth noting down if you can spot them. Okay, now with those emotions, ask yourself, Why do I feel that? And if you're truthful enough with yourself, you'll most likely get an answer 1 or 2 whys deep. For example, why do I think I feel that emotion? Then, with that answer, why do I think I have that thought? The answers might surprise you. Now, if you spot any questions, statements, or words that you think could be causing a negative effect, ask yourself what narratives or thought patterns could you replace it with that would instead serve you, and one that you feel and believe. Then you could continue to run that until it runs on its own. Okay, so now knowing what you shouldn't do when masturbating, let's go over a summary of what you should do during conscious masturbation to improve your sexual performance, impressing and having your sexual partner come back for more, like you are now their new addiction. Okay, the physical aspect. Use a toy you can penetrate in a way that has you engage the muscles you would be using during sex. Slow down, extending the duration of your session to or past the time you wish to last during sex. Try to disengage the pelvic floor muscles responsible for squeezing as much as you can. The emotional aspect. Sitting with more positive emotions will be the best option. However, if you are sitting with any negative emotions, at the very least, try to be conscious about them. Now, in this instance, you may even want to extend the duration of your session even longer. If you think you don't have much time, but you still feel like masturbating, then you're probably better off not enforcing the pattern that could be making your performance in bed worse. In other words, only masturbating when you have the time and you're in a calm state. And finally, the mental aspect. The best way to approach this, if you find it difficult to even spot old patterns running, is simply to create new thoughts as you practice consciously masturbating. Just being more conscious about the physical and emotional aspect could be a brand new pattern of itself, so combining that with a brand new thought pattern may also work. Even just being intentional about how you masturbate easily deserves a new thought pattern, something like I am worthy, an abundant thought that will be very beneficial when it comes to the bedroom. Now, this should be an easy one to believe because you're putting in the work to improve not just for you, but for someone else as well. Now, sometimes what could be causing a lack of stamina could be a negative subconscious narrative running. It may be deep and powerful enough to be a major issue, in which case you would need to dig deep and find it to consciously come up with a replacement. Now, a lot of this for so many people that have not done much self-development work can feel very abstract and like it's going to be a lot of work. But this is especially for those that have tried methods like edging or the start-stop method and found it did absolutely nothing. It's most likely because you were only doing, say, 10% or less of what you needed to do, and if anything, you might have even still been making things worse with that way of masturbating, only using 10%. This is practically the same type of method, but on steroids. Who knew that masturbating could be such a self-explorative journey that could benefit not just the bedroom, but your entire life? If you would like more videos like this one, plus a whole library of content that was even removed from YouTube, check out totalmanperformance.com. Plus, gain access to an entire 4-week-long video course on how to increase the size of your lad. It's 100% free, and I promise it is real. Enjoy, and I'll see you in the next video.